Good afternoon, everybody. How are we? We're all here. I think it's time we got to start. My name is Andy Mitchell. I'm the Chief Exec of Tideway, or the Super Sewer. And some weeks ago now, I took over as co-chair of the Construction Leadership Council. So I'm really keen to hear what people say, and I'm particularly keen to hear comments from the audience. So we need to make sure we've got enough time to allow that to happen. So the title of this session is the Construction Leadership Challenge, delivering on the ambitions of the 420 million sector deal. Now, the industrial strategy was published in July 2018 as one of a suite of industrial strategies produced by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, as we know as BEIS. Now, this strategy stated that the construction sector, quote, reaches every corner of the United Kingdom and touches each of our lives. We're in the early days of one of the greatest construction programs in our history, from delivering more homes that people can afford in the places where they want to live, to major infrastructure projects. The pace of this change and the size of this opportunity demands a construction sector that is the best in the world. Now, the sector deal is based on three strategic and I think now recognizable principles of digital, manufacturing and whole life performance. And we're going to hear quite a lot more about that from our panel of illustrious speakers in a second. Now, this is all very good and forward-looking and sets a really positive and ambitious stance for the industry. However, this is against a backdrop of ever-increasing demands of society in terms of housing, schools, hospitals, transport, communication, you name it. An increasing population, both nationally and globally, and I think without doubt a changing climate, and with a backdrop of also an aging population of the construction workforce, and one that's heavily skewed still towards men rather than all of us. Technological changes that I think we would say are unprecedented, although I'm fairly sure previous generations have talked about unprecedented technological change as well. And of course, we've got a current industry, the productivity of which lags behind many, many other industries, and an industry in which we simply have to fix issues like prompt payment and fair practice generally. So we have our challenges set out. We also have our challenges for today. And for the next hour, we've got a couple of things to do. One is to listen to what our speakers have to say, but ultimately develop three recommendations for action by government and the sector, and come up with the answer to one simple question, which is, what is the one thing that government could do to help construction meet this challenge? So I'd like to introduce our five speakers who are going to help us with that and kick this off. First, we have Anne Bentley. Wave. They're in order, so you'll get the hang of it, but that's Anne on this end. CLC member, Global Board Director of Ryder Levitt Bucknell, and author of Procuring for Value. We then have Sam Stacey, Challenge Director, Transforming Construction, UKRI. We have Peter Caplehorn, Deputy Chief Exec and Policy Director of the CPA, the Construction Products Association. Lynne Sullivan, OBE, Principal, LSA Studio, and Chair of the Good Homes Alliance, and member of the Green Construction Board. I bet there's other things that you just haven't put on the list as well. And finally, Julia Barrett, Director, Rethinking at Willmott, Dixon. So, we have five speakers, a small but perfectly formed audience, three recommendations, one question, 1 hour. I can't see why that's not going to work. So without more ado, let's get started. Speakers, we have a maximum of 10 minutes each. Less is good, more is sackable. On with Anne. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, just testing that the technology works. So first of all, thank you, Andy, for the introduction. As Andy said, I was one of the authors of a piece of work that was published probably 8 or 9 months ago now called Procuring for Value. And the background to Procuring for Value was the construction challenge that had been laid down in the 2013 construction strategy, which was really how, as a society, can we produce more houses, more rail capacity, more schools, basically more product for the same cost, but also probably at greater value from the construction industry. Many of you will be aware of the stats that have been going around for 2 or 3 years now, that whilst the overall UK economy has substantially improved its productivity over the last 10 or 15 years, but the construction sector has, although improved it a little, has not improved at the same rate. And whereas at one time we could say that we were right at the forefront of productivity, sadly that's not the case. So productivity was our driver in terms of the piece of work that I've done. But that had to be in the framework of what the Construction Leadership Council was doing. And again, as Andy said, we're looking at 3 key areas. So the key areas we've looked at are digital, manufacturing, and whole life performance. I have to say that I think whole life performance is rather the Cinderella of it all. Digital sounds really with it and sexy, and manufacturing gets a lot of press and everybody's interested in it. But actually, all of us have to live and work and inhabit the buildings and assets that we produce. And often the whole life performance is rather left to the end of the agenda. So that's the bit I've been particularly concentrating on. And again, the way that we've looked at this is trying to break it down into bite-sized chunks. So the particular piece of work that I've been involved in is actually how does procurement interact with the whole of the rest of the construction life cycle, and can procurement be a far more interactive part of the process? At the moment, it's often seen as something that's a necessary evil rather than something that adds real value to the construction process. So a lot of work that we did was behind the scenes in terms of raising whole life performance and procurement up the agenda. And when the construction deal was published, again last July, I'm delighted that one of the things that was in the deal was recognition of whole life performance. In fact, it was a bit stronger than that. The government actually said that going forward, whole life performance would be a factor that was taken into account in the procurement and business planning processes of construction projects. Now, some of you who are close to government would argue that has probably always been the case, but the fact that it's got priority, it's got mention, and people are beginning to talk about it is really quite critical. So, again, I'm sure that many of you won't have read the report that we published. Unless you're insomniac, it's probably not worth reading, because it really only has 3 recommendations, which I can fill you in with now, rather than reading it. And the 3 fundamental issues that we're trying to deal with are, where do the clients fit in? So how can clients actually change behaviours in the construction process using their huge power of influence and their effectively pulling power, if you like? But the second thing, and this is really a big complaint, if you like, from the supplier's side, is how do we actually improve transparency? In fact, to be fair, it's clients and supply side. So what clients want is transparency in terms of the performance of their assets. When a client signs a multi-million or even billion-pound contract, what level of certainty do they actually have that the building or asset will actually do the thing that they believe they paid for? And suppliers want a degree of transparency in terms of, if we've done a really good job, how does that count towards getting the next job? Or do we just go back to ground zero again and everybody starts in the same place? And then the third bit that I won't dwell on now, but this is a particularly important bit from a supplier's point of view, is really making the industry fairer, if you like, getting the basics right, improving things like payment, sorting out retention, standardizing contract terms. And they're the three big areas that we've been looking at. And the conclusion that we came to, and it's a fairly simple conclusion for quite a large piece of work, is that if clients demand to get certainty of what they actually want, i.e. what they're paying for, then their definition of value, or indeed the industry's definition of value, needs to be much broader than simple cost. Now, I think everybody inherently gets this. Everybody knows that it's not just cost. But actually, a lot of these things disappear during the course of certainly the business casing and then the design phase. And what we all know is if the design phase results in a tender that's too expensive, then a lot of good stuff gets cut out in a value engineering exercise. So what we're endeavouring to do, and we've boiled it down to 11 key points. And unless the clients can actually understand and prioritise these points and ascribe value to them in a meaningful way, a way that means you can actually do comparisons, it's actually quite unlikely that the product that's delivered will be exactly the product that they believe they've paid for. So, a piece of work that, again, my group did, this is a piece of work that was done by Gardner and Theobald. They did a detailed assessment of quite a lot of projects in terms of what the client believed they'd paid for and what was actually in the tender, if you like. Now, this slide is a load of figures and probably won't mean much to you, but effectively what they said to the client was, from the client's brief, rates in basically weight out of 100. So a construction project can only be 100%. It can't be 105 or 110%. So if it's 100%, where do you think the importance of the factors of this building lie, if you like, so the elements? And what you'll see from the numbers in the weighting column are percentages that the client allocated to them. What G&T then did was analyse what was actually designed, fortunately not built. Now, I took the labels off it. The labels wouldn't have helped in this arena. But what it shows is that an element that the client actually thought was worth about 8% ended up costing 46% of the construction cost. Now, in anybody's mind, that could not be value. However you cut that or recut that, that could not represent value. And yet, the experience of companies like my own company and Gardner Theobald is this happens often and continuously. And although great intentions have been set at the design or the business planning stage, a lot of those intentions simply do not get translated into the design and construction process. So what we're endeavouring to do with our Procuring for Value project is creating a model that allows clients and consultants and designers and contractors to actually analyse these factors in a meaningful way, which means that when decisions are made, the probability of delivering a product that meets the original business plan is considerably higher than it is at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Right, Sam. Yes, please. Thank you.
Here we go. So I'm going to talk about the Transforming Construction Programme, the government money that's being provided to help the construction industry, and how we're allocating that. So first of all, a little bit on why. I think it's fairly obvious to everybody here that there's a huge need to do things with the construction industry. We've got problems with overrunning of costs, performance of buildings. We've got disruption due to flooding, and the industry has to cope with that sort of thing. So we know that there's a strong incentive to do things differently, and we're absolutely convinced that there's the opportunity to do that. And more than anything, that's captured by this pie chart here. More than 50% of the activities in the construction industry today are non-value adding for the end customer. So an enormous amount of opportunity to improve. And then in terms of the imperative, we've got to think about the employment side of the industry, the fact that with the amount of people and the skills we've got in the industry today, if we continue to build in the way that we're building today, we just can't get it all done. We've got a pipeline of construction procurement. 650 billion has been published as a pipeline of construction over the next 10 years. We cannot do that with the skills that we've got today and the amount of people that we're training in the industry. The good news is that partly looking at this waste thing, but also in terms of the techniques we know are possible, it's absolutely feasible to massively improve the productivity of what we do. So a few years ago, 2013, a group of people from the Construction Leadership Council and the government came up with targets that were considered feasible for the construction industry. So a lot of people will have seen these before, and we have made some progress towards these. These are targets for 2025. But with the construction sector deal and the Transforming Construction programme, we're looking to really kick the graph up to point in the direction of achieving these targets by 2025. So I won't go into the details. You can read all this, and everyone will be familiar with the basic intention of this. As Anne has mentioned, the three themes that are working here, and I'm glad we've got consistent messaging here: digital, manufacturing, and performance. Anne's explained these enough, so I won't go into these more. And indeed, the next slide is consistent with Anne's message here. So procuring differently, having the innovation in terms of coming up with the better solutions for the industry, and then providing the skills both in terms of individuals and companies in order to deliver this innovation to the procurers that are asking for different things. I also think a useful model is to think of it in terms of new vertical and horizontal integration of the industry. As we know at the moment, the industry is massively fragmented. So at every layer where you're competitive tendering through the value chain, that is like a barrier to innovation. One way or another, we have to get more vertically integrated in the industry. And we can either do that by proper vertically integrated companies, which under certain circumstances are hugely efficient, or a sort of virtual approach where there is much more partnering between the layers in the value chain. So with part of our investment in transforming construction, we'll be coming up with standard products and processes for the industry and encouraging partnerships and vertical integration to deliver those or deliver buildings using those standard products and processes. Active buildings is another important part of the program. That's energy positive buildings, buildings that generate more power than they consume. And the same thing applies in terms of the way that we need to produce energy positive buildings in terms of vertical integration of the supply chain. But cross-cutting all this, we have horizontal innovation, horizontal integration. So very much aligned with procuring for value, there is this need to capture and share much better information about all the activities of the construction industry. Based on that, we'll be able to apply artificial intelligence, and there is an amazing amount going on, partly in construction, but worldwide in terms of machine learning and the ability to process data much more effectively. So if we've got that data, we can feed that into the machines that can learn and provide much better guidance for the decision making in the construction industry. This slide also obviously has skills on because the skills capabilities are essential to this equation as well. So how does it fit into the industrial strategy? So people may be familiar with these 4 grand challenges of the industrial strategy: clean growth, healthy aging, future of mobility, and AI and the data economy. So there's a 2 billion pot that the government has come up with to support the industrial strategy, and we've got 170 million of government money to support transforming construction sitting under the clean growth heading. But as you'll see, there's a fair amount of synergies with the other parts of the industrial strategy as well, in terms of producing environments for older people or improving transport and mobility. So the way the equation works from a government point of view is essentially we come up with the solutions, we advise those solutions to government procurement, and government then pulls or demands those solutions from the supply chain. The fundamental thing here, or the headline, is the presumption for off-site. So from the beginning of 2019, from the beginning of this year, government procurement has had a presumption for off-site. In other words, if you're not going to demand off-site solutions from your supply chain, there needs to be a good reason why not. So albeit the 170 million of sort of innovation funding that the government's putting into construction is a relatively modest budget. There is a vast budget associated with government procurement, and obviously the power of procurement is huge to bring new ways of doing things through the supply chain. So we're coming up with the solutions, we're advising the clients, and that's not just public sector clients, private sector as well, where applicable, and we're supporting the supply chain in delivering those solutions. In terms of the split of the pot of money that I've got direct control of, the Construction Innovation Hub, or Core Innovation Hub, is getting 72 million. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The Active Building Centre, 36 million, and then the rest on R&D projects, de-risking solutions for the industry. And then you'll have seen a figure on the board in terms of 420 million being allocated or being earmarked for transforming construction. The rest, the 250 million, is provided from the industry. So we've got commitments from the industry to supply that extra 250 million. So the way that the Construction or Core Innovation Hub works is essentially the money's going to 3 centres, each doing these things mentioned here. The MTC, the Building Research Establishment, and University of Cambridge Centre for Digital Built Britain. So standard products and processes primarily through the MTC, validation, certification and industry engagement through the BRE, and the digital side of things through Cambridge. And in that, very much providing the models and the proof or the justification for this whole life value concept that Anne's talked about. The Active Building Centre, we're also investing in. So associated with Swansea University, where they've piloted various energy positive buildings already and really produced some spectacular results in terms of that. So buildings that are great to use and have this surplus energy coming out of them at really very little extra cost over and above what a standard building would have produced. This is the centre that will be built. There are a number of pilot buildings already in existence, and this is the centre that will be built as part of the programme. Just in terms of the timeline, a lot of the spending commitments have been made already. So the 4 centres, the 3 centres associated with the Construction Innovation Hub and the Active Building Centre, we've committed money to. We've committed about 20 million to research already, and we'll be spending up to 39 million on on research going forward. So that's the timeline and the programme. So I hope some of the people in this audience here will be bidding for some of the remaining funding that we've got available. I won't go through this now. Maybe I'll leave it up for a few minutes for people to look at it. These are the outcomes and the targets associated with each part of the Transforming Construction portfolio. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to
Very good.
At that point.
Thank you, Sam. Right, so next we have Peter Caplehorn.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Oh, we're just destroying the equipment while we're going through. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's terrific following on from Sam just to see that optimistic perspective of what we've got lined out there. And certainly from a products point of view, from a manufacturing point of view, this is really exciting news. We have really struggled in the industry, I think, for decades in terms of where are we going, what are we producing, how is that going to affect everybody across the whole built environment. This is a really new approach, and one that I think anybody who's been in the industry for a long time has been desperate to see. So I think all of that is really good news, and you can probably sense I've got a but coming. And that but is that we should not underestimate the scope of the challenge ahead of us. If we are trying to, if you like, reinvent the construction industry, if we're trying to make sure that all of these wonderful things are joined up, and certainly I'm 100% supporter of all that, we have really got to get into the DNA of the industry and work out how we can make things go better. I think the evidence of that is never, sadly, more true than what we saw happen at the Grenfell disaster, for instance. That was a turning point in terms of we really have to do better in terms of delivered performance. We really have to do better in terms of the people who use and occupy buildings. And since then, an awful lot of work has been going on in terms of how those things can never happen again, how we approach analysis of design, how we deliver proper performance on the ground. All of the work that we've got coming out of the sector deal should absolutely support that. Certainly a greater focus on manufacturing and how manufacturing can help, effectively making manufacturing come closer to the construction site, I think is an absolute fundamental going forward. Equally, the embracing of digital techniques is a key part of this. Other industries, aeronautics and aviation in particular, long ago grappled with digitalization. Back in the 80s, planes were being designed using digital techniques. We are still at the early stages with that, with construction, still not properly joined up. And we've got a lot of initiatives coming through the sector deal, making products to a uniform digitalized process, making sure that the information can be integrated right from the early parts of the specification right the way through to completion and in use. After all, quite often at the moment, we have buildings that are handed over and we don't actually know what products are on the building. That's part of that substitution process that Anne mentioned. That is a real tragedy because we absolutely need to know precisely what's in the finalised building to ensure that the performance, the ongoing maintenance, and certainly the longevity of the building is there implanted from the very start. So there's some crucial elements that we have got to really get to grips with and think about how the industry is going to tackle them and go forward. Equally, that thread of procurement is crucial, and that's tied up with the other questions that we've got to answer. So does procurement help or hinder most of the time? I think actually at the moment it probably hinders, probably doesn't deliver the outcomes, and as we've seen from the slides previously, that can be demonstrated quite clearly. So we've got to really focus as an industry, what are the outcomes we want? Do we really want to deliver efficient buildings that people find attractive and are safe and easy to use in the future, and also contribute to both the resources and the energy load that we're putting on the planet as a whole? I think the question also is about, is the industry a good place to work? Quite often we have a situation where people would rather go into other industries. And so how are we going to attract those skills and that talent going forward? And that is also part of this question that I think the sector deal is going to start to answer. It's a challenge, and we should not underestimate just how much work there is to do. But I don't want to be classed as a moaning Minnie, I just want to be realistic. I think the fact is that we've got a lot of great things that we are now starting to embark on. The fact that we've got a centre for innovation, the fact that we are looking at net positive energy buildings at last, that puts a completely different complexion on the road to zero energy. It puts a completely different complexion on how buildings contribute to the environment going forward. So I think that's the key thing. So I suppose my main message in all this is that this is great news, it's really exciting, but we have a lot of joining up to do across industry. Certainly the manufacturing and the product sector are very keen to help and are already engaged in quite a lot of this work going forward, and we look forward to standing here possibly in a year or two's time and talking about the successes, the achievements and the progress that we've made for the whole industry and the country. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Peter. Right, next we have Lynne Sullivan.
Thank you. So I'm a member of the Green Construction Board, which was formerly a standalone advisor to government on greening the industry, and now we report to the Construction Leadership Council, and our chair, David Pinder, is a member. So I don't think my slide has arrived yet, but just me. Yeah, okay, so like Anne and others, I started with the 2013 Construction 2025 strategy, which of course put the writing on the wall in terms of our productivity, our need to reduce cost and efficiency in the industry. But the kind of Cinderella there was that it also proposed a reduction of 50%, halving built environment emissions by 50% by 2025, which actually is an enormous ask, not least because actually one of those pretty pictures is a retrofit which halves energy use, and we don't talk about retrofit, I think, nearly enough. So last year, Theresa May at Jodrell Bank said we were to halve all new build emissions by 2030, so that gives us an extra 5 years grace. So let's set about that challenge. And that was in the context of the published Clean Growth Strategy. So as a member of Green Construction Board, I am now chairing a task group on recommendations on how to deliver that. And of course, today we're talking about the industrial strategy and the fact that the government is really putting its money where its mouth is in terms of the modernization of this industry. But I have to say, will that modernization produce an industry that's fit for purpose in terms of its carbon emissions? So we are being reminded by our children and actually by local authorities who've declared climate emergencies and who want to go net zero by 2030, let alone halving. And indeed, many of the core cities group who've set this same challenge. We need to act very quickly because I have to say, when the construction strategy was originally published in 2013, we had a kind of vestige of a zero carbon policy. It's very much been in the doldrums ever since, so we've got quite a lot of ground to make up. And we were given another wake-up call following last year's IPCC report. We're given another wake-up call last week, which was the Climate Change Committee's report, and which basically set out its view that our housing, new homes are not performing as they should. They should be zero carbon ASAP. And our existing homes, we're basically not going to get there anytime soon. And given that the built environment's responsible for 40% of all UK emissions, there or thereabouts, the fact is we're replacing our stock at the rate of, 1 or 2% per annum. We really have to address the existing stock. Incidentally, I've just been chairing a session actually with the consultant who did all the underpinning report for the Climate Change Committee report. And their work shows that actually you can achieve zero carbon new homes for an extra over of less than £3,000, which in the light of the recent announcements about house builder profits, I think puts it all in rather sharp perspective. In the meantime, our energy demands are going up, so clearly, this is adding to the weight for urgent action. And we need also to be reminded that we're not at the moment, counting the embodied carbon of the industry. So if you accept that we are responsible for 40%-ish of all UK emissions, then probably 5 to 10% of that is basically about the stuff that we use in and around buildings and indeed infrastructure. So we need to develop much better accuracy in terms of both the provenance and the performance of our products and their ingredients. And I'm hoping that the sector deal funding will produce better knowledge in that area. So, one of the sort of fairly commonplace techniques for management consultants is to move from process to results. And I feel we're at this sort of moment in time when we really need to do that. Clearly, the strategy and the challenge fund projects are all moving us towards a modernization of the industry. So if we have an industry that's fit for purpose, that's great. We tune up all our processes, that's great. But at the end of the day, we need to be called to account. So I really believe that the next move in terms of regulation and our trajectory over the next 10 years has to be on a requirement for disclosure of outcomes. And this includes performance on energy use. And for the Green Construction Board, we've been looking at various examples of where this level of radical change has been achieved. And we had a very nice chap from Vancouver City Council, Sean Pender, came over and told us their plan for going to net zero emissions by 2025. And they've kicked it off in 2015. And they're basically tightening the fabric. They're improving the efficiency of kit. Yes, of course, they'll be adopting smart procurement and digitalization and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, the developers know that by 2025, they will have to disclose all building energy use, all building energy emissions. So they've set that out. They're now incentivizing the early adopters through planning process and other fiscal measures, which I think is really fascinating. And we should take a lead from that. So the slides I originally put to the board on how to respond to this challenge phrased the challenge of halving all building energy use. And by the way, there is an accompanying challenge on halving the cost of delivering the same standards for our existing stock. But yeah, this has to be defined as a holistic challenge. And so it has to include health and well-being outcomes. It has to be good for our exports. It has to be good for our industry and our supply chain. So we need that clarity of objective, the clarity of the trajectory for regulation, and then we can start to motor. But yes, unlike the previous zero carbon policies, it mustn't be a singular challenge. It has to be a holistic challenge. So the work that we've been doing has actually set about, how do you get to net zero? You don't just tune up your processes, coming back to results. How do you get to net zero? You anticipate the total energy, you validate that by measurement, and then you work back from it, you backcast. So actually, our objective is net zero, so ideally we drive down all our building energy demand and we match it with renewable energy. It's easier said than done, but there are very good examples, and we're about to produce a report which gives evidence of projects and techniques which have delivered this objective already. So we've got Energiesprong in the Netherlands, we've got Neighbours in Australia, we've got Specific, the active building centre we've already heard about, and we've got Passive House, which has also delivered net zero buildings when they add the renewables to Passive House Plus. And all of these techniques are being applied currently on projects in the UK. So we've already measured some of them and got them into our data set. So look out for that information. So in other words, it can be done, and we should do it as quickly as possible, and we have to drive forward on regulation and think about other forms of incentive. And I just thought I'd depart with Energisprong, which is the first Energisprong in the UK, which is a net zero outcome, guaranteed for 30 years, by the way. The residents sign up to an energy contract, and their full expectation is that it is delivered year on year. So if this can be done on a retrofit, it can absolutely be done, as we've just heard from Climate Change Committee, for new build. And it's not just homes. This is being applied. This technique is being applied on all types of buildings. So my hope is that the Challenge Fund projects address the energy performance outcome and address the retrofit challenge, because this is an industrialized solution, and we could certainly do with a lot more innovation in retrofit. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much. Right, last but no means least, Julia Barrett.
Good afternoon. As Annie says, I'm Julia Barrett, and I head up Rethinking, which is Willmott Dixon's central sustainability team. I joined 7 years ago after a career which started in the chemical industry and took me through the public sector before I landed in construction. Now, Willmott Dixon is a tier 1 contractor and is probably one of the UK's largest builders of property for all uses, delivering around 2,000 homes a year. And although we have a turnover in excess of £1.25 billion a year, we're probably one of the largest companies that you've never heard of. Being privately owned means that we're not left responding to the vagaries of the stock market and shareholder pressures in quite the same way as some of the others in our sector. We're dedicated to leaving a positive legacy in the communities and on the environment. And these values were as true in 1852 when we were formed as they are today. We simply didn't have special words like sustainability to describe them. We just knew it was about doing the right thing. And what is the right thing? Too many people that I talk to say it's delivering a project on time, to budget, and to the right quality. Isn't that just delivering the contract? You'd be really annoyed if you bought a car and it was delivered late, in the wrong colour, and the price had gone up. I've yet to find another sector like construction that's a whole vocabulary based around handing over a defective product and fixing it in use. One of our regional boards recently described what we call sustainability as the real added value. Ironically, those additional benefits that are often hidden away in the quality part of a tender submission. Now, as Anne said earlier, some of the ways that we describe this added value are whole life or life cycle costing, maximising performance and minimising the cost in use, or ensuring that we've closed the performance gap between design and as-built. It might be creating great environments through the use of biodiversity and fabulous outside spaces, using great daylighting and air quality to deliver spaces where people can be more productive, have improved mental health, and reduce sickness rates. We also add value by maximising our social impact, transforming the lives of young people and employing apprentices who are, after all, our workforce of the future. We stimulate the local economy through local purchasing and by using SMEs. And we protect the planet through responsible and ethical procurement. As a tier 1 contractor, we're heavily reliant on our supply chain to deliver for our customers. One of our values is to make them a reflection of Willmott Dixon, which is why we've worked hard to ensure that we pay them at an average of 32 days, as evidenced by the recent data published by Build UK. We were also one of the first signatories to the government's prompt payment code and are only one of a handful of companies, and indeed the only contractor, to hold the Carbon Trust supply chain standard. Particularly in the public sector, these cost-quality splits are unhelpful and actually denude value when funding pots are controlled by different stakeholders. For instance, when the Education Funding Agency may be funding the capital costs, a local authority or even the school itself will be paying the operating costs. And that will be from the same pot as they pay for books and teachers. Are these different competing funds really best value for my taxpayer pound? Is there a better model of procurement out there which, rather than feeling like a deselection process, focuses on the creation of shared value and doesn't rely on contractors making their money through managing project cash flow? Are we really going to realise these efficiencies by standardising pre-qualification questionnaires? And in trying to speed up procurement, have we in fact come full circle? Frameworks were supposed to stop the inefficient merry-go-round of bidding. Now there are over 700 frameworks, and qualifying in itself may be a waste of time if we don't deliver any work through them. As Willmott Dixon's current sustainability strategy is coming to the end of its life, having seen us reduce our operational carbon emissions by 59% and our construction waste arisings by 57%, we're heavily engaged in looking forward as to what we should be doing in the period to 2030. One thing's become very clear. Our future strategy will be less about what we can do to reduce our impact on the world, and increasingly about how the changing world will impact our business. Now, we've already heard that we're at the start of a massive construction programme to meet the demands for affordable homes in sustainable communities supported by great infrastructure. So I wonder then if we're being ambitious enough, or are simply trying to improve suboptimal systems and to digitise analogue processes. I still consider myself a relative newcomer, and my reflections are that this is the case. We're part of a massive, non-homogeneous sector, from billion-pound turnover companies to sole traders, covering everything from highways and rails and super sewers to homes and hospitals. Existing strategy policy approaches and regulatory solutions often fail to differentiate between these sectors and sizes, and perhaps it's time for a more differentiated approach. Having started my life working as a process engineer on a chemical factory, effectively a fixed site where you could optimise production efficiency, I've been really struck since joining construction about how people underestimate the disruption and relearning necessary every time you start a new project. We have around 120 projects live on the ground at any one time, but every time we set up a project, we're reliant on two things: our systems and processes and our people to get it right. And I'm quite sure that's why the nature of building sites hasn't changed much in the last 70 years. We know that when we work with a customer over an extended period on a programme of projects, that we deliver more efficiently and effectively because we establish strong relationships, taking out that one variable, helping to collaboratively deliver better buildings and projects. Off-site and modular construction, I fear, are being seen as a panacea for all ills. And of course, there will be benefits. But I do wonder whether this is the CD of the construction industry, a phase where we try and encourage the creation and ownership of production assets that need to be fully utilised in an industry where this hasn't been the operating model to date. And that's before we consider the downside for local supply chains in terms of goods and skilled tradespeople, and the impacts on traffic, air quality, and fuel consumption. What I personally worry about, and I have plenty of colleagues who think I'm slightly out of touch with reality, is whether we're lulling ourselves into a false sense of security, whether our competitors of the future are actually coming around the blind side, not hampered by the mindsets of, this is the way we've always done it round here. We're already seeing signals of change in other sectors. Uber is the world's largest cab company that owns no cabs. Airbnb is the world's largest accommodation provider and owns no buildings. Google is the world's largest investor in driverless technology. And none of these are names that were synonymous in the sectors in which they operate even 10 years ago. They weren't hampered by the mindsets of how things have always been done. They were ready to innovate and do things differently. We've all seen YouTube videos of printed homes, accelerated multi-storey construction. The future's here, somewhere. There's no doubt that we do have a challenge on our hands, and the sector deal has an important part to play. But I would ask whether we've challenged ourselves to go far enough or fast enough. Thank you.
Very good. Right, thank you, speakers. I've got a few questions for the speakers, but I wonder, are there any thoughts or observations or questions from the audience? We've got one over there, almost inevitable, one here. Do we have a microphone? So we start over here with this wonderful gentleman. Keith.
This is for you.
No. Try again.
Andy, and thank you very much for all the speakers. I really enjoyed that. My name's Keith Waller. I run the Construction Innovation Hub, which is charged with trying to deliver the ambitions of the industrial strategy. Previous to that, I spent 9 years in the Treasury. So I wrote the Infrastructure Carbon Review in 2013. I wrote Transforming Infrastructure Performance. So I've been living this for a while, and it is really difficult to affect change. And it's really difficult to get people to understand the challenges and how to address them. But I was particularly struck by everyone appears to be pointing in the same direction, but I'm not sure we've yet clearly articulated what the end point is. And I don't think it is, how do we do construction better? That is the wrong question to be asking. The question we should be asking is, how do we do a better thing? So actually we shouldn't be thinking about, can we construct the same thing in a more efficient way? Can we construct the same thing in a better way? We should be asking about how we deliver a better built environment that supports the broader social, economic and environmental outcomes we want. So I think absolutely agree with the speakers in terms of we have to be stretched, we have to be challenged. But I think if we focus too narrowly on the construction process, we will miss those fantastic opportunities to support the industrial strategy ambitions and deliver better outcomes, not just for users, not just for owners, not just for clients, not just for pupils or patients in our buildings. It's about how do we support society as a whole. And that procurement has an important role, government has an important role. Andy, you said there was one thing you wanted the answer to that. What's the answer to it all? Well, actually, if you come to my session on Thursday morning at 10:30, I will explain that.
I can't wait. Literally, I can't wait. So we had Jim Clark here. I don't know Jim, but I could read your name badge.
Thank you. Jim Clark from Policy Connect. We work with some of the panel members on construction and policy in Parliament. Julia spoke about the fact that we need to be more ambitious with transforming industry, and Peter spoke about the fact that we need to uprate things like energy and fire safety, some of the policy things that we've worked with. The trouble is if you go to a lot of events like I do, you hear a lot of people from the industry talking about warm words about, oh, well, we must never let something like Grenfell happen again. The trouble is I've had lots of sort of off-the-record conversations with lots of people, and they've told me that they don't think much has changed really. What I want to ask you is, I interviewed a lot of house builders recently, and I want to ask, do you think that people from the industry, whether they're contractors or construction companies, have the incentives they need to build better, or do you think the government should pursue stronger regulations?
May I? Yeah. Well, I hope that my talk very much supported the suggestion that we should improve regulation. And I think the way to do it is to require transparency of outcomes, which is really what the Hackett review suggested we needed, much better verification of the end product. I think the way to incentivize the industry is to set a path to being judged by the results. And that means, verification of outcomes. It's been done elsewhere, it's being done. And I take sustainability and energy performance as a proxy for quality, albeit, there are issues about time and efficiency and so on as well. But I think that would be a terrific wake-up call, and I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's a no-brainer.
Jim, hello? Hello? Right. Take your point entirely, but I think there's there's an old story about how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb. One, but the light bulb's really got to want to change. So the issue for me is the industry has really got to want to change. Now, I'm equally working with a lot of people on the post-Grenfell reform and all the rest of it. And people say to me commonly, and I think you have, nothing's changed. And that's because it's a big question and there's lots going on. There are literally thousands of people involved in resolution of some of those problems, thousands of people working on a better place. So I think we can take some confidence in saying things are happening, and yes, we do need stronger regulations. We need people to understand that regulations are regulations, and that's really crucial. I think building regs mainly have gone by the board over the last few years, and so I think that is absolutely crucial. So what we really want from government is a carrot-shaped stick. That's most important, so that we can get past this hurdle. I think it is coming, but the sector deal is certainly going to play a big part in this. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody, Dijan Eisenthal from Wood. I think the whole setup really is fundamentally wrong. I mean, the fact that you're sitting here only from the construction sector, that is the beginning of being wrong, really. What in fact should be happening is you should have the household owner on the panel, you should have the investor, you should have the energy company there, because we are all working in the silos here. You're asking somebody to invest money, and whoever is investing money, he wants to do it as cheaply as possible. And then the risk is transferred to the owner of that property, whoever that is, whether it's the private individual or the industrial. And then he needs to make the money out of the inefficient stock, dealing with the energy silo as it is now. So the whole thing needs to be transformed, really. How do we work across these individual sectors, rather than shifting the risk from one sector to another? And just to add to the lady talking about Uber never made any profit, still doesn't. It's investment-led initiative, and it's very questionable whether it would ever make any profit. Google uses the big data, uses everybody's data, so we know all about that and the cyber security. So there are issues with all these nice things that we want to be involved with, but I think if we can address this cross-sectorial silos working culture, which is really the key to all this.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I would say we're absolutely trying to work across silos. I would say the heart of transforming construction is about fixing the ecosystem to enable better solutions to flow through. At the moment, we have an industry that is set up in such a way that it's massively resistant to better outcomes. I absolutely support what Keith was saying earlier about producing something better, not just producing the same thing in a better way. We have to produce better things. But at heart, we have to address the ecosystem to enable that to be done. And we've been very careful, and I'm a great supporter of the work that's been done to join up all the moving parts, all the bits of the jigsaw, in order to affect that fundamental change to the ecosystem. And then these things flow through, and then we get, then you can come up with regulation that will pull massive improvement through the industry. You can come up with better products and more valuable outcomes, and apply that or create that in an efficient way. But at the moment, we have a broken ecosystem, or an ecosystem that doesn't foster successful outcomes.
And one of the things I would add to that is, I mean, certainly from the CLC's perspective, a lot of what we're doing is, if you like, government-led, so it's not necessarily private sector-led. And the government has a huge advantage there, where they might not be the absolute funder, but they're certainly the releaser of funds. They certainly have quite a lot of control about the users. They certainly have a lot of convening power in terms of actually what a good outcome would be. And one of the really strong messages that I think the CLC are giving back to government is that government must act as an entity, because even within government you'll have education, housing, etc., etc. And I think we're moving much closer to that. I mean, I think, you know, some of the work we're seeing from the sector deal is really pushing the government departments to work as one. And so I completely agree with you that we're just a small group of representatives. And unless you go across the whole industry, you're never going to... I mean, you know, sorry, changing the subject slightly, but between the panel, we probably recognise 80% of the audience. And there is a really big accusation that people like us just end up talking to ourselves. And I think that's a really valid point.
If I could just come in and address some of Jim's points as well. We do need to think across, and I don't think it is just about more building regs and about safety regs. Actually, there are perversities with, as I said in my piece, different set funding pots means that we cannot drive whole life cost. The fact that we can build a block of flats, but to generate electricity and then use it for the benefit of the residents, you have to set up an ESCO. If you want to have 100% renewable housing development, you still have to pay for an electricity supply through the district network operator that would supply the maximum electricity on the coldest day with the maximum people in the property. There's some daft regulation in there that is really stopping us doing the right thing, and it's those sorts of blockages that I think we need to be working with government on.
Okay, thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Gary Clark. I'm chair of the RIBA Sustainable Futures Group. Just like to kind of make a couple of comments, and it's a question to one of the panelists. Picking up the thing is, I think the industry is actually working together. The RIBA is working with all the other professional institutions, and we're developing a sustainable outcomes framework, which tries to kind of put together all the things, the challenges that we're trying to do here. Picking up Lynne's point really is about verification. We need a stick, and we need a very sort of sensitive and a very careful stick, but it's verification. We've got to understand how our buildings perform in reality. That's the first thing. The carrot really comes into, which is a kind of perceived barrier, is actually the added value side of things. So I'd just like to ask, I think it's Anne, you mentioned that. Really, we're in our sort of, our toolkit, our sustainable outcomes toolkit, we are looking for evidence in terms of added value and how to persuade, you know, clients and other people who are maybe negative to this. There's actually a win-win here. So if you maybe sort of answer that, and obviously any other panelists if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, we'd probably come to the same conclusion from different starting places, because what our work very quickly has sort of ascertained is that in any project there will be a number of absolutes. But the number of absolutes are usually quite small, so there might be an absolute budget. With the Olympics, there was an absolute time when it had to be delivered. But there's an enormous amount of what we call tradables, and what clients very rarely get high-quality advice on, if I'm honest, is the relationship between those tradables. So, you know, is environmental sustainability of greater importance than local labour? I mean, that's not a question a client even knows the vocabulary how to answer, because the question isn't presented to them in a sensible way that they can actually come to any conclusion. And of course, most clients would go, well, no, we want both. And then you go, so are you going to have a smaller building then? Because you can't afford both. But actually, what we found in our research is there are either genuine values or there are proxy values for almost anything you can possibly think of might contribute not just to the building, but to the use of the building, how the building sits in the environment, etc. And so what we're really working hard at the moment is to simplify that so that we can come up with a methodology that actually allows clients and end users and advisors and financiers to work together to go, okay, it's not perfect, but this sort of fits what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions that people need to get off their chest? Right. Okay, thank you. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. There's a few points I wanted to try and pull out. First off, could I ask for a show of hands of people who believe that in 10 years' time we are going to see people working in this space that aren't there now? So that's the Uber and the Airbnb type question. Who thinks that's inevitable? And who thinks that's not inevitable? Some other people aren't using their arms at all, but okay, so that, I mean, it's an interesting point, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it may be a necessary catalyst for change, but that certainly chimes with a lot of discussions I've had that, and I think what I was telling me is we should be welcoming and looking to drag people into this industry, rather than trying to look after construction PLC, because I kind of think that may be a source of change. That's helpful, thank you. So look, we've talked about the 2013 ambitions for 2025, which was about 33% less cost and 50% faster and 50% less emissions. And here we are in 2019, and I think starting to shuffle and feel uncomfortable about the fact that 2025 is not far away. Could I ask for a show of hands of people who believe that without some fairly clear legislation on the right things, but without some fairly clear legislation, we're simply not going to get there? I.e., does government have actually, and we have a role therefore to help government tell us what it is we need, but do people believe that? Show of hands again, please, yeah? And people who think the legislation doesn't have a role to play? So, new, simplified, focused, whatever it means, but whenever we figure out what that means, we should be quite clear and quite pointed with government to say, this is tolerable, this is not. That's kind of what I think I'm hearing people say. I like the carrot-shaped stick. So Anne, we've had a number of discussions from the audience, and you've talked about the huge importance of being able to specify performance. With a backdrop of what was described as a deselection process or a race to the bottom, I've heard it called that as well. Do you think we're going to get anywhere unless we get a lot more clear about what it is we're trying to do?
Well, I am, anybody who knows me knows I am an eternal optimist. And I think there's already some really good practice out there. The issue is that the good practice doesn't get half as much press as the bad practice. And so we often report the things that have gone wrong. But I think that the moves that are being made, mainly in the infrastructure area, it has to be said, rather than probably housing or vertical construction, actually give me heart that we are capable of looking at performance. And where you get some of the big infrastructure companies that own their own assets, and so have a real vested interest in actually increasing the performance and lowering the performance cost of those assets, then we've seen vast improvements. So I actually think that there is a way of moving this forward, and we actually need to take a lot of this best practice, slightly rebadge it, and then push it back out into other parts of the industry. Yeah. So I'm not as pessimistic as many.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other thoughts from the floor? One back there, sorry. Yes, sir.
Günter Jedlichka, UKRI Housing Office. We build passive houses now for more than 14 years, and we have so much good experience. We accommodate around 3,000 international students each year in Austria in our passive houses. So it's so simple. It's positive. It's a typical win-win situation. The students are happy. We are happy because we have such a low energy bill. And in the near future, we will build nearly zero energy houses. And what is also important, I want to mention, in the last 25 years, the Passive House Conference was either in Austria or in Germany. This year, it will be the first time in China. So they have understood that they have to change.
Okay, thank you very much. That was going to bring me to my slightly tongue-in-cheek last question. I'm very pleased to see we've got a gender-balanced panel. That go back a few years and we wouldn't have seen that, but we do all have one thing in common, and that is our age. And it was good to hear you, well, broadly speaking. And actually, when you look around the audience, we're sort of drifting towards the top end. Some very young faces excluded, obviously. Is there more that we should be doing to listen to the people whose future we're talking about?
Yeah.
You know, it's fine. Problem of having experience and going through life is that you understand all the problems. If you were 24 and you were sat here, you'd probably be saying something different. Does that? Who would rather, if the people on this panel were all below 25? Hands up.
I wish. Yeah.
No offense to them. No.
Thanks, everyone. A vote of confidence in the old.
Yeah. No, okay. I think we're about done. Look, thank you very much indeed. I've got some very helpful feedback there. I'll write up these recommendations. You'll see it published on the website anyway. But thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.